Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Rwanda, More Than Mountain Gorillas, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Craig Glatthaar. Thank you so much for being here today. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to tell you all about an incredible place, an incredible country, Rwanda. That is without a doubt one of the most progressive countries on the African continent. So I'm very happy to share with you that there's so much more to the secrets of Rwanda than just the charismatic mountain gorillas. And today we're also going to look at not only the mountain gorillas, but a whole lot of other experiences to have within Rwanda. And of course, how these all come together to form what is an incredible ecotourism and conservation model in Rwanda. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off and we'll start the presentation. You will not see my bearded face for a little while, which I'm sure my wife would be even happier to hear, but I'm going to jump off the webcam and we'll be getting into the presentation now. Right, so Rwanda, so much more than mountain gorillas. To provide you with a little bit of context before we get into the details of Rwanda, again, my name is Craig Glatthaar, Expedition Leader for Natural Habitat, and I've guided many trips to Rwanda before and currently work for a company known as Wilderness Safaris, where we are busy building out an incredible ecotourism circuit in Rwanda that introduces our natural habitat guests to a lot more than just the mountain gorillas, and that's what we're going to look at this evening. There's a photo of me on one of the trips, and that walking to the left of me is of course not a border collie. That would be one of the mountain gorillas, and that gives you a bit of perspective how up and close and personal one can get to these incredible charismatic species. A little bit of context for the country to start. So Rwanda is one of the smallest countries in Africa, although it is also one of the most densely populated, with a population of just over 12 million people. And that brings into acute focus the challenges in a heavily populated country that is at the moment building out their ecotourism areas and actually expanding natural habitat for both mountain gorillas and other species that have been translocated or relocated to Rwanda. So it's a fascinating case study for how countries can look at expanding their natural habitat with a burgeoning and growing population. To give you a little bit of context to the size of the country, it's just a little bit larger than Vermont. Anyone from Europe's checking in about the size of Macedonia. The main currency is the Rwandan franc, and 3 official languages being French, English, and then of course Kinyarwanda, which is a local tribal language. We're going to look at 3 different areas in the country. We're first going to go up to the north to Volcanoes National Park, one of our lodges, the Sati Lodge there. Then we're going to go to the far east of the country on the right side of your screen to the Akagera National Park that is highlighted there in the darker brown. And then we're going to go to a very, very small primary forest where we're busy building a chimpanzee ecotourism model known as Geshwati. So of course, Rwanda is most well known for its most charismatic species, the mountain gorilla. Gorilla berengi is the subspecies scientific name, and it's certainly the most well known of all the great ape subspecies. But there's just under 1,000 of these animals that remain, and they remain in isolated populations in these natural islands as part of the Virunga Massif, which is a mountain range in the northern part of the country, and also across the border from Rwanda into Uganda, into an area known as the Bwindi Forest. And they're an incredibly charismatic species, as I mentioned. They're also unbelievably smelly. Imagine an extremely hairy human being that has never bathed since the day they were born. You often get to smell them before you see them. But what is amazing about the mountain gorillas is they are the most over-commercialized mammal on Earth in a good way. Because if it wasn't for Diane Fossey, an incredible American primatologist or not academically trained primatologist, but rather a naturalist that learned primatology through spending time with these mountain gorillas, their plight would never have been heard or understood. And effectively, her work there brought attention to this species, and it was ecotourism that saved this species from extinction. A mere few hundred individuals up to just under 1,000 today and growing. So if we jump back into how this ecotourism model works and how we build an ecotourism economy in a country like Rwanda. Well, we first start with mountain gorillas. They are essentially the cash cow of the ecotourism business, as we've touched on now. Building a lodge experience where they are located, but more importantly, building a reforestation program there too. From there, we expand the program out to the east of the country, where we built a lodge called Magashi in Akagera National Park. And then we complete the circuit by looking at a chimpanzee experience as a complementary product in a small forest area known as Geshwati. And we're going to look at these three independent areas this evening as we go through this incredible itinerary. So first to the northern part of the country, to Volcanoes National Park. So as I mentioned, that is part of the Virunga Massif, which is a mountain range that straddles three countries, being Rwanda, of course, that we're looking at here, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is to the northwest, and then Uganda, which is to the northeast. And it's home to 6 towering extinct volcanoes that penetrate the clouds in this incredible cloud forest habitat. If you're interested, those volcano names are Kirisimbi, Basoki, Vuabura, Gahinga, Sabinyo, and Makino. Quite exciting names. And the first area we're going to look at is one of the lodges that Wilderness Safaris runs in that area, which is called the Kiswati Lodge. But it's a whole lot more than just a lodge. And that's what our talk is about this evening, is ecotourism modeling. The Kiswati Lodge is actually a vision of reforestation and rehabilitation. That means that every guest that visits there is effectively contributing to biodiversity conservation and the local tourism communities. And the idea around the lodge is to build a lodge outside the national park, but at the same time to reforest all the land between the lodge and the national park, thereby extending the home range for these mountain gorilla families. There's 12 groups of mountain gorillas that call this Virunga Massif home, and the only problem that we have is that their habitat is not expanding, but their numbers certainly are. So as you can see, this map shows you some of those family groups named there: Titus, and Sabinyo, Agasha, Amahoro. And as you can see, those family groups are living in close proximity by the circled buttons there. And so that close proximity means that they are under pressure in terms of needing to move into more expanded habitat. And the idea with building lodges along the edges of Volcanoes National Park is effectively each lodge that is built there now is under directive from the Rwandan Development Board to buy land leading from the lodge to the national park and reforest it and expand the natural habitat for these incredible gorillas. Now, if we consider that Kiswati is seen as a center of excellence for our guests to learn about the great apes, it also means that this entire concept is so much more than just seeing the mountain gorillas. The park was gazetted in 1925, and as I mentioned, Diane Fossey brought the attention of mountain gorillas to all of us in the 70s and 80s as the research changed the way this great ape species is viewed. And each group and each family that one would visit has its own fascinating origins and family stories. And once you allocate it to one of the families for a trek in the morning, you get to learn all about each individual family's histories, and the ranger's delight in elaborating on the individuals in all of the family groups. Now, bear in mind, only 8 people at any given time are allowed to trek to see the mountain gorillas. It's a moderate to strenuous walk. Many of the treks that I've guided on have been no longer than an hour to the gorillas and an hour back, with one exception that was about 3 hours to the gorillas and 3 hours back. But the vast majority of treks we have done have been relatively short, but they're considered moderate to slightly strenuous, as there is altitude to contend with, anything between 10,000 to 12,500 feet altitude in this area. But it's an incredible experience to be in close proximity with these mountain gorillas for an hour. And there's a whole lot of regulations governed by the IUCN Great Apes group that regulates that we can spend an hour with the gorillas, that only people over the age of 15 are allowed to trek with the gorillas, and that the group size is only 8 persons. And this is all done to relieve any pressure on the gorilla families. Of course, they're extremely habituated. It's not uncommon to have gorillas brush past you. I had a silverback push me out the way, very gently push me out the way at over 5 times my weight. You could have done a lot worse if you wanted to, but they're extremely gentle, calm animals that'll come quite close up to you, have a look, see what you're doing, and carry on with their feeding behavior. You can see this lovely photo of a youngster swinging in the vines in the bamboo forest leading up to the top of the Virunga Massif. So the gorilla experience for guests does not only end at the park boundary. And as you can see here at the lodge itself, we engage in discussions and presentations from primatologists based at the Dian Fossey Research Center, known as the Karasoki Research Center. And there they cover topics such as their genetics, endangered status, maybe the diet, behavior, why they struggle to survive in captivity, all of these interesting questions that come to light. But this image is wonderful in showing how ecotourism models are built in Rwanda. Is all of that land that you can see is heavily agricultural, cultivated land, extends from the lodge to the mountain range, to the Virunga Massif, and those mountains in the background is where the mountain gorillas are. And it's this land that Wilderness Safaris has been busy reforesting and replanting to create these extended habitat corridors for mountain gorillas and other species to be able to grow their populations and extend into. The amount of land is just under 70,000 acres in size, intriguing and varied topography, as you can see here. And it shields and protects the lodge from any unnatural disturbances blocking out light from a village nearby, which is known as Kanigi, and the town of Musanze. And it gives all the guests there a sense of being actually inside the national park with views straight onto that incredible Virunga Massif. There we get a view looking from the Virunga Massif back towards the actual lodge, and there's the 6 rooms up on the hill. So this would be the view that mountain gorillas might have looking back on the lodge. You can see it's situated within this amphitheater of these eroded volcanic cones. It's certainly at an altitude. That lodge that you're looking at right there, stuck into the hill, is on the slopes of about 11,000 feet of Mount Pasoki. And next to it, often shrouded in cloud, you can see is Kirisimbi, which is the highest volcano actually in that range. And then, of course, climbing above the lodge to the hilltop plateau, you get these beautiful 360-degree views of the entire area, the Musanze districts it's known as, and eastward towards the other volcanoes. Quickly to just touch on the lodge, and I'm not going to go into details around scatter cushions and the like, because this is a presentation around ecotourism modeling. I wanted to just touch on that all of the lodges that are built here have to submit an external EIA, or environmental impact assessment. And that's where the light footprint of building the lodges and building the ecotourism models actually begin. So in the construction phase already, the lodges have a crew that it has to adhere to really strict, environmentally sensitive building guidelines. You can see from inside this lodge, Basati Lodge here, that a lot of the products used is natural weavings, natural raffia palming, local non-indigenous woods, invasive trees are cut to use for the building and construction of the lodge. And as you can see, minimal use of stone or other more permanent materials. There is volcanic rock used for the fireplace, of course, but absolutely zero concrete is used in the construction of this lodge. And the whole ecotourism model really centers around a whole lot more than just building a camp. We have to ensure that our model of sustainable conservation is rooted in the lodge's very existence, and I use the word rooted purposefully, because given Rwanda's really intense agricultural model, the country does have a limited number of indigenous trees outside of the national park, And this is where our reforestation project is vital in terms of converting this agricultural land into mountain gorilla natural habitat once again. And you can see that this is where the start or the grounding of our nursery began at the lodge. And the area around the lodge, Kiswati, is set to follow the Volcanoes natural vegetation zones. So here we are looking at all different forms of species that are being planted, a bamboo forest in the low-lying areas, along with other pioneer species that grow really quickly in the low-lying areas. Those would be species known as Dombeya and Newpetonia. And then further up, as we move up in altitude, we start to plant species that are a little longer lived, such as Eugenias, and they form this beautiful forest woodland that then leads up into the more cloud forest zones, which is the naturally occurring habitat where the mountain gorillas are. The Kiswati's reforestation project also employs a bunch of the local community members, led by this wonderful giant smiling gentleman called Jean-Maurice Habimana. So not only is it about reforestation, it's also about community engagement and ensuring that there's employment opportunities for the locals and the skill sets that they are developing in managing the nursery. From there, we start to see the actual success of the project. Now, the lodge foundation was laid in early 2017, and give it 4 years later, almost 5 years later, and all the camera traps that have been placed on the property has started to see that hillside at the bottom right of your image convert from a heavily agricultural landscape to a completely indigenous reforested landscape. And we've started to see the return of a number of indigenous species there. The butterfly is always the first to come in. They're your key indicator species. Then it's the birds. Birds are a key indicator species because they can survive in a varied number of habitats, obviously with the ability to fly between habitats. But the most important key indicator species that really says you've got it, your reforestation is a success, is when you start to see the return of mammals to this area. You can see on the top right, that's one of the genets. That's actually a melanistic or black genet, which is unusual coloration. And then on the bottom left, you see a golden monkey. And on the top left of the screen, you can see a cat there being a serval cat. And very recently, we actually had video footage that we are still cutting and putting together to put out there in the marketplace of a mountain gorilla that was moving between the forest and the lodge area, caught on one of our camera traps. So that is the thumbprint, the kudos, the feather in the cap for the reforestation project having worked successfully. Now, it's not only about reforestation, it's also about the community and ecotourism, and how communities engage and benefit from ecotourism is a very, very important part, and something that many guests want to engage in and understand. And almost everyone living in this area is engaged in some form or other in family-orientated agriculture. That could be growing a crop known as pyrethrum, which is actually a natural insecticide, or it could be potatoes or any other crops used for subsistence living. The plot sizes in and around the lodge area are tiny, but this rich volcanic soil more than makes up for this. So given the small plot sizes, finding suitable land when we started building the lodge was quite complicated. We wanted an area large enough to hold a meaningful reforestation project, but we also needed land that had not been settled or used for subsistence agriculture, but more commercial agriculture. So that's where the Kiswati's steep slopes and the absence of this habitation made it the best possible site to build the lodge. But then we did purchase farming land in the community, and that was a really, really important part of building this ecotourism model. So under the supervision and guidance of the Msanzi District Authority, we began negotiations with 161 plot owners, and that's where we bought the base for the reforestation project. And the purchasing of that plot land gave opportunity to those plot owners to buy even more land, but further away from the Volcanoes National Park, allowing us to create this corridor connection between the national park and the agricultural land we had bought. While members in that community were able to buy land elsewhere, further away from the boundary lines of the national park, and even expand their farming practices and improve their actual livelihood. So about 300 members of the broader Basati community formed a cooperative known as the Tisimeroni Cooperative, and it's this cooperative through which we conduct all our business with the local community. And it's here we also get the guests to engage in experiences like visiting some of the supported coffee farms and cultural centers that we've been building and supporting in this area. I'm going to touch on a lovely story about this lady known as Sephora. She was a member of the broader community in this area where we built the lodge, tragically widowed in 2015. And she was left as the only breadwinner for her family, which was a family of 4 young daughters. I think they were aged between 12 and 18, and she had one son just over 20 years of age. And we met her when negotiations to purchase in the land had reached an advanced stage. And of course, her financial circumstances were in dire straits. But the financial support followed over the next few months as a member of the Wilderness Safaris team decided to help her in his personal capacity. And taking proceeds from the sale of her land right on the boundary line to the national park, Sephora bought a new and more productive agricultural plot, which is now farmed by her son, thus supporting the family. And then the proceeds from the sale of her land also allowed her to construct a house for her son there and the purchase of 2 other village plots, big enough for subsistence agriculture. So from owning 1 small plot of land on the boundary line to the national park, owning 3 plots of land, living in one with her daughter, renting the other one out to generate further income, and one for her son to now farm. It's amazing to see how her life story has changed around through this ecotourism model. Now we're going to move from there. Once we had built the lodge centered around the mountain gorilla experiences and improving community engagement and reforestation in that area in the northern part of Rwanda, we then took the model to the far east. That's to the far right-hand side of your screen, to a national park known as Akagera. You can see it highlighted there in dark. And this is where we built a lodge in the northern part of Akagera, known as Magashi Lodge. And here we could expand the mountain gorilla experience to include a savanna safari experience, let's say a more traditional type of wildlife experience. Akagera went through some dramatic changes pre-1994, so pre the Rwandan genocide. It was almost 3/4 shy of 1 million acres in size. Of course, post the Rwandan genocide in 1994, a large number of refugees, Tutsi refugees moving back into Rwanda, meant that they de-gazetted a large part of the park, and it shrunk from 740,000 acres down to just shy of 250,000 acres in size. And we were left with just this area, a crucial area. The area previously, of course, had been home to a number of megafauna. That's a fancy word for large mammals, elephant and lion and leopard and rhino and all these charismatic species one wants to see on safari, giraffe, zebra, etc. A lot of those had been poached out, and all that remained was this pristine, beautiful habitat, incredible topography. But we needed to start again with the rebuilding of Akagera National Park and the translocation and reintroduction of charismatic species. And that was funded and supported largely by African Parks. And they invited Wilderness Safaris to come into the area to build a luxury lodge once the translocation and relocation of all those larger mammals, larger charismatic species had been underway for some time. And that's where the ecotourism model then started to kick off once again. It's an incredible and very, very diverse park. To give you some context, 250,000 acres in size with 10 different topography or habitat types. Everything from open plains and grassy plateaus down to riverine forest, papyrus edges, and beautiful lake and river system running along the Kagera River. That is the boundary line to Tanzania, which is further to the east of the park or to the right of the park here. A very fascinating fact, this park at 250,000 acres, if we compare that to the Kruger National Park in South Africa, 5 million acres, yet both national parks have almost the same number of bird species. Now, you might remember, as I mentioned earlier, bird species are key indicator species. A greater variety and number of bird species is a great indicator of varied habitat types. So a small park, but because of the incredible varied habitat types and the amazing topography, as you can see in this image here, high plateaus going down through woodland to open grasslands, it means it can sustain a great diversity of large mammal species, as well as a good number of large mammal species, even though it's not an exceptionally large national park. You can see from this drone image, incredible diversity in the habitat types from those highland areas down through the woodland. You can see clearly the woodland that then meets the grassland that then cuts through to the edge of these riparian and riverine habitat lines that are interspersed with all these beautiful lake systems. Highest densities of hippo and crocodile for any national park in Africa, and a high number of lake systems connecting to the Kagera River. As I mentioned before, anyone who's a birder, now I like to consider myself an enthusiastic birder. I definitely have a reputation for misidentifying a lot of birds, but I'm enthusiastic about my birding. This is a beautiful little guy called the Papyrus Gonele, which is a partial endemic to this part of Rwanda. And there's a number of great bird species that are seen here. And even though I don't have photos of it for this presentation, we've recently started a shoebill stork survey in Akagera National Park, and we're starting to see shoebill storks returning to the national park, not in high numbers, but the fact that they're returning is again evidence of how this ecotourism model is sustaining and rebuilding these incredible areas in Rwanda. There's some views of Topi down into the river systems. Here's a great shot of diversity and species. There you've got virtual zebra or plain zebra in the background, Topi and Oribi all on the grassy plains. Some of the bigger megafauna in the park, of course, buffalo. Everyone wants to see those, except not on foot. So certainly not on foot without a tree nearby. And then, of course, the reintroduction of elephant to the park, brought to Rwanda by African parks. And then from there on, in 2015, they embarked on an incredible reintroduction program, bringing lions from South Africa to the national park. And those lion numbers eventually split into 3 different prides that tend to congregate in the northern part of Akagera National Park. And they've always had incredibly high leopard densities in Akagera National Park. Now, the reason why leopard densities have been so high in Akagera is because the lion weren't there for a long time. As I mentioned, they were only reintroduced in 2015. And I'm going to put my head on the block and say this, for me, is one of the top 5 parks on the entire African continent for leopard viewing. We have identified no less than 16 leopard just in the northern part of the park, where Wilderness Safaris has their Magashi Lodge on the peninsula known as the Magashi Peninsula. So incredible leopard viewing. And then, of course, interesting statistics and citizen science that we've been conducting in collaboration with African parks on elephant and elephant movement in the park. So since the reintroduction of elephants in the park, what we've noted is that the bull elephants, the male elephants, they tend to favor the northern and southern parts of the park. You can see them represented by the purple polygon on the north and the south of the park there. And the breeding herds, which are of course led by a matriarchal female, they tend to move around the center of the park, occasionally going into the north and the south and bumping into the bull elephants. This could be a great case study in as to why the ladies, when they move into the north and the south and meet the bull elephants, they decide no, and then they go back into the middle. Nice peace and quiet, just hang around the middle of the park rather. We have, of course, also been doing interesting spatial ecology studies around the lion pride movements. And as I mentioned, once all the lions had been translocated to the park in 2015, they started to breed, of course, and separate into smaller sub-prides. We've now identified 3 primary prides that tend to frequent the northern part of Akagera National Park. And you can see those represented by the 3 different polygon colors there in red, green, and blue. And then, of course, once the translocation, the movement of these larger mammals happens, and successfully so, African parks engaged with wilderness safaris to build a luxury tourism experience in the northern part of the park, and that was the establishment of Magashi Lodge, which, as you can see, is beautifully located on the edge of one of the main lakes in that area, known as Lake Rwanda, and there's another lake on the other side called Lake Mahindi. And there you can see arrival to the park, to the lodge rather, pretty spectacular, coming in on one of the swamp buggies or the boats. And you can see there's a nice deck chair on the roof of that boat, and that's how you can see over those papyrus lines to look for those beautiful birds like Papyrus Gonele, or if I'm lucky enough, shoebill storks. And beautiful, really classic Meru-style raised tents looking out onto the lake. Again, I won't get into the detail around the lodge and the lodge offerings. We can always follow up with you guys on that in more detail another time, but we're going to look more at this ecotourism model. And importantly so, over 70% of the staff members now working at Magashi Lodge all live within a 20-kilometer radius of the national park. So again, ecotourism providing the platform, the foundation to fund economic growth in the region. It's all about making the area, the natural habitat, more economically viable than, say, mining or fracking or whatever else one might want to do in that area instead. And then, of course, the important part of ecotourism is not only closing the loop between reforestation, reintroduction of keystone species, and engagement and economic opportunity for the community, it's also about closing the loop with the guests. And this is where we've started introducing the guests to various different identikits. So they're able to play a part in all of the spatial ecology studies regarding leopard numbers, identikits for lions, and then, of course, the most exciting development that happened in late 2017, the reintroduction of black rhino to the park. Here you can see, not to get into too much detail here, but this is what's known as a phylogenetic tree, and this is just showing all of the genetic splits between the lions that were reintroduced and how they're splitting into different prides, one of the primary prides there being the Amahoro pride. And you can see the different identikits enabling the researchers based in the park to study what's happening with pride dynamics. And here we see the identikit for the eastern black rhino that have been reintroduced into the northern part of the park. So 5 black rhino brought from a zoo in Czechoslovakia, interestingly enough, or Czech Republic rather, brought into the park, and then a number of eastern black rhino from other parts of East Africa, brought into the southern part of the park. So there we've completed the circle on Akagera National Park, and now we're going to go all the way across to the west of the park, to the west of the country rather, all the way across to the boundary lines of Lake Kivu. You can see that large lake on the left-hand side of the presentation. We're going to go all the way to Lake Kivu. We're going to go to an incredible area known as the Geshwati Forest. And this is in its infancy. So here we're starting to see how we close that ecotourism loop as we expand from a mountain gorilla experience to a savanna experience, and now finally to a chimpanzee and smaller primate experience in a forest known as Kiswati. So, unfortunately, the much abused and historically degraded Geshwati Forest suffered about a 98% reduction in size since the 1970s under agricultural pressure. And the net result of that reduction in size of that forest was extreme environmental degradation, affecting the agricultural community, landslides, erosion, silted river systems, much reduced agricultural yields. So as we all know, forests form a very important buffer or filter to reduce any form of environmental degradation, being things such as erosion and silting of rivers. So as this forest reduced in size and the agriculture grew, agricultural elements started to come apart at the seams as the foundations to sustain any agriculture are essentially areas of naturally remaining habitat. And so this relic forest fragment remained, 2% remained, and was about to completely disappear until we wilderness safaris engaged with the Rwandan Development Board and an incredible NGO known as the Forest of Hope. And the Forest of Hope as an NGO is largely the grassroots business responsible for securing this 2% remaining primary cloud forest. And they have worked to secure the goodwill of the local community, and together with Wilderness Safari start building an ecotourism model in this park. And that's what we're going to look at now and see how that works. Don't get too astounded by all of the written detail that I'm going to show you right now. This is something taken from our project proposal and gives you a good idea as to exactly how do we build a lodge and how do we build an ecotourism model at one single lodge. And the first part of building that lodge starts with providing a base for what we term the chimpanzee economy. The chimpanzees are the charismatic species. They're the catchment species in this area, much like the mountain gorillas are in Volcanoes National Park, much like the lion, the leopard, the elephant, the rhino, the buffalo are in Akagera National Park. So we provide the base for the chimpanzee economy through forest protection and conservation by partnering with the NGO, Forest of Hope Association. And at the same time, we start to consider park expansion and reforestation to provide the ecosystem services to reduce all of that land degradation and silting of rivers and effect on the agricultural yields, which are all around and surrounding this small forest system here. From there, we then start to look at how do we engage in terms of activating the chimpanzee economy. And how do we activate the chimpanzee economy is by building a multi-tiered tourism accommodation to provide access for the tourism community. And at the same time, that has to then generate sufficient revenue to cover base costs for the park and potentially add revenue to start reforesting areas of the park and reforesting the river systems that run through the park and feed the agricultural communities around them. That then brings us to the next part of building that chimpanzee economy, and that is how we share that chimpanzee economy. And that involves training and employment for that tourism and conservation sectors. The conservation sectors protecting the park, researching, etc., and the tourism sectors around the lodge that we're going to be building there. And then, of course, building on offering tourism experiences outside of the forest and the park. And then, of course, engaging in educational programs to bring a greater level of understanding from the local community as to how protecting this area is going to aid their livelihoods. Lastly is respecting and retaining the cultural tradition around the chimpanzee economy. So that cultural tradition is retained in the design of the lodge, but also it's retained in the experience of guiding guests through the forest to see the chimpanzees. It's retained in building out local tourism businesses, being pottery or agaseki basket making, and then of course just engaging in regular engagement with leaders in the community as well as children in the community. There's a wonderful saying built around children and conservation, and that goes, if you will only protect what you understand, you'll only understand what you know, and you'll only know what you have been taught. So that's where the eco clubs, which are a bunch of educational programs that we run, starts to engage with younger members in that community. So that's a very simple idea as to how we build an ecotourism model in Geshwati. So, touching on the forest. So the Geshwati tourism experience offers an exclusive access to what is essentially semi-habituated chimpanzees. We're in the middle of the habituation process. I will show you some details of that research now. And that provides the opportunity for guests to participate and be part already now of the ecotourism model that we are building in that area. And as you can see, historically, this area was quite a large part of the northwestern sector of Rwanda and reduced down to about 2% of what it was historically. The forest protects the majority of the headwaters from 2 river systems that are critical to the livelihoods of around 100,000 people downstream of those 2 river systems. And those 2 river systems are the river systems that we will be reforesting to reduce the erosion, the silting, and all of that environmental degradation. So you can see on the left of the slide, a little bit complicated, but it's effectively showing the area that we're seeing to the right here, and it's effectively showing the erosion hotspots, and you can see there's a lot of red in that area. And there we can see on the right, we can see the 2 river systems that come out of that forest indicated by the dark green. And you can see how little of forest is actually surrounding those river systems. It's just at the start of the river systems. And as the rivers drain into the lake on the left of that image, you can see that there's hydro plants there. And so an important part of the ecotourism model here is actually not only delivering drinking and irrigation water for the small-scale farmers, but it's also protecting the watershed. It's protecting the hydro plants. There you can see there's 2 major hydro plants that are generating all of that hydropower that sustains a lot of businesses in the area. And that's a very, very important part of the ecotourism model here. Now, how do we start with all of that? Well, we start with Forest of Hope, and that's where we started the partnership with this non-governmental organization, and they play an important part or role as an intermediary between ourselves, the ecotourism model, the park management, as well as the local community. And they've been helping already in our goals to expand business opportunities as tourism starts to return to the region. And that could be opportunities in providing agricultural resources for the ecotourism area, such as honey, or it could be more traditional tourism businesses, such as souvenirs and curio developments, etc. And then, of course, it also involves the protection of the park and the management of the park, and, of course, the chimpanzee habituation program. The ultimate goal is to then expand all of these national park areas and link them through reforested corridors, and we effectively then have a reforested and replenished and reintroduced ecotourism circuit in Rwanda. Now again in Geshwati, that's going to of course start with establishing, where we have already established rather, several community-owned indigenous tree nurseries, using local labor of course, and then progressively reforest the newly acquired land along those river systems, delivering those ecosystem services to the agricultural sector, and at the same time expanding habitat, most importantly, for the chimpanzees that remain in that forest. And this is the current crux of the project, or rather the project we've been focusing at the moment. Maybe inconveniently so, during COVID time, there haven't been many tourists visiting this area, so it's allowed us to really focus on the chimpanzee habituation over the last year. And here we can see some chimp habituation metrics from June last year till July this year. I'm still waiting for the metrics to come in from the Karasoke Research Center for August, and then of course September, as we go into September. And there you can see the total number of individuals encountered in orange, average group size in lighter gray, and then the average duration of contact in a darker gray, and then the summaries between all 3 of those are what we term habituation success rate. Interesting to note that success rates tend to peak in the middle of the year, around August, September, and that might have to do with the movement of the chimpanzees, which is largely based around fruiting season. So here we can see some heat maps that show where the chimpanzees are moving at different times of the year. This is a comparative heat map between July last year and July this year. We can see that they were less spread out than they were in the prior year. But importantly, over an entire year, we start to build heat maps that show the movement on chimpanzees within this forested area. And that starts to also help us in terms of research of understanding why habituation metrics are better at certain times of the year than other times of the year, which also helps us then structure according to the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. According to the IUCN Great Apes regulation, we can start to build some protocols around engaging with chimpanzees and bringing guests into the forest. At the same time, using these heat maps, we can then start to structure where are the walking trails that we are going to be cutting in the forest for guests to see and experience the chimpanzees. Here you can start to see the walking trails that we're starting to cut and put into that forested area based around those chimpanzee habituation metrics. And that effectively closes the loop on ecotourism modeling. 50 minutes, I had to rush a little bit at the end there, but it effectively closes the loop on ecotourism modeling and how that modeling works in a country, and how one catalyst, being mountain gorillas, a very charismatic species, how one catalyst, how one lady, Diane Fossey, and how all of you guests, tourists that want to spend your hard-earned money in these beautiful parts of the world, how they can effectively serve as a catalyst to expand natural habitat in the region, while at the same time serve the local community in those areas. It's an incredible model, and it's certainly ecotourism, in my opinion, is without a doubt essentially the model that is going to save ourselves from ourselves as we replenish and reforest these beautiful areas in countries like Rwanda. So I'm going to hand that back over to Rob, because I hope we have a few questions. And if we can't get through all the questions, we will, of course, follow up with you post this webinar series. Thank you very much for joining, everybody.
Thank you, Craig. I appreciate that. And we do have a few questions. So before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. First, one of our commenters just wanted to know how great she thought you were, thanking you for the great information, photos, and humor. So we appreciate the entertainment.
Thank you.
So when is the best time to go on the ultimate gorilla safari?
Great question. And I'm going to hit you with this: any time's a good time to go, but there is, of course, certain areas that one wants to consider. So a couple of things to talk around that point, because they're certainly climate related and season related. Equatorial climate, of course, on the equator effectively. When one's talking specifically around mountain gorillas, you're talking about altitude and you're talking about a cloud forest. So it can be really wet and can be quite cold at altitude. There are interestingly enough, there are two primary rain seasons and two primary dry seasons in Rwanda. So the two rain seasons are luckily short. There's an exceptionally short rain season between October to early December, and then there's a longer rain season between February and say mid-April. So one might want to avoid the two rain season periods, which means outside of that you want to be traveling between May to late September, early October, and then you've got a shorter window from December through to maybe late January. Those are your dry seasons. That's just mountain gorilla related. If you move from the mountain gorillas in the west of the country all the way across to the east of the country, you've dropped from 11,000 feet in altitude to a couple of hundred feet above altitude. Completely different climatic zone, and effectively a great experience year round, less affected by altitudinal changes in the climate.
And how physically challenging are the mountain gorilla trips?
So that's a great question, and it can vary because mountain gorillas can move wherever mountain gorillas want to move effectively up those mountains. Having said that, I've done a lot of mountain gorilla treks personally, and have found them, I would describe them as moderate to strenuous, just because of the altitude, not because of the distance walked, nor the habitat you're walking through. So I live at sea level, so for me altitude is more of an issue. So that's where I would describe it as a little bit harder to acclimatize to the altitude. However, in terms of time, most of the walks go from the national park headquarters and go through some potato farmland. You cross into a bamboo forest. if you're lucky, you see the gorillas already in the bamboo forest. So we're talking about a 30 to 40-minute walk and you're already seeing them. If you're less lucky, you see them just outside the bamboo forest. So we're talking about an hour walk to see them, an hour walk back. If you're particularly unlucky, you might be on a 2, worst case, 3-hour walk to see them, 3-hour walk back. What is great though is they do, when the park headquarters divide everybody up into their groups of 8, because it's a maximum of 8 people that get to see the gorillas, they do take into account your physical ability. And so they do tend to group people that have less physical ability to walk hard. They tend to group them going to the gorilla groups that are closer, and then people that are more manageable, maybe the younger crowd, they get to do the harder walks to see the gorillas further up. But generally, most of the gorilla groups are quite close and easy to see. For people who have mobility issues, that's not even an issue, because you have porters carrying your bags, carrying your backpack. You can get porters to help you carry your camera gear. And I know a lot of people will take a lot of camera gear for gorillas, but we can get into detail on photography. It's quite challenging with dark faces, dark eyes, poor lighting, etc. Often the best camera to take is your iPhone. I know that sounds ridiculous to say, but it's often the best one because you've got the gorillas in close proximity. So you've got porters to help carry your gear, and if you have mobility challenges, they even have porters that carry effectively a stretcher. One could liken it to a queen's box, as they call it, and they will literally carry you up the mountain and carry you down the mountain. And these guys are fitter than some of the fittest people I've ever met, so they have no issue carrying people up and down those mountains. So mobility should not be something that prevents you from seeing mountain gorillas.
Great, that's good to know. So speaking of the habitats, is there a benefit to the gene pool to provide connectivity to these habitats?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Gosh, now we're going to go down the rabbit hole of what they call gene isolation. And that is a major concern, is the fact that for a number of these species, mountain gorillas included, the problem with not being able to expand their habitat is your genetic diversity starts to erode. Once your genetic diversity starts to erode, those animals become more susceptible to any form of infection, obviously start to struggle to survive in these environments. And so increasing corridors, increasing connection between different family groups, between different genetic pools, is essential to improving the genetic diversity in these species. It's probably amongst large mammals the single most challenging conservation issue we face in the future, is the fact that we're seeing more and more that habitats are becoming isolated island habitats, and that genetic diversity is eroding. And so how we currently are managing to deal with that is by translocating various species. So moving lions from South Africa to Tanzania, and moving lions from Tanzania down to South Africa, and then improving the genetic diversity. That's a very mechanically human or anthropogenic exercise, and a costly one at that. A more effective way of increasing genetic diversity is effectively creating bridges or corridors between these populations so they can naturally disperse in terms of genetic diversity. Very, very good question, and very important in this.
So what is your biggest obstacles in meeting your eco goals? Now, you talked about reclaiming the forest and natural habitats and about the community and culture, but what is the hardest part for you?
Sure, I would say the hardest challenge in realizing our ecotourism goals is driving an understanding and acceptance at stakeholder level, where we say, let's say government level, and this is where Rwanda is incredible. I mentioned it's the most progressive country in Africa, and I stand by that. Is the most challenging part is effectively building an understanding and acceptance at policy making, government level, that ecotourism modeling can be more economically lucrative for the country and for the population than many other models that one might describe as degrading to the environment, whether it be agriculture or mining or any of those type of industries. And there's a fine balance between all of the industries that have to coexist or find the homeostasis, find the equilibrium between all those industries. And so ecotourism is a model that's continually under pressure to prove itself as an economically viable model to policymakers. Of course, COVID hasn't helped that in recent times, but we are seeing an immense demand for travel returning, and we feel that this is a wonderful opportunity for ecotourism to showcase how invaluable it is to countries' economies. And certainly countries in Africa have felt the pinch of no tourism, and that has brought some acute realization to many countries that the tourism model is essential for the country's economic well-being. So that's something we fight with every day. Rwanda, luckily, is an incredibly progressive nation, as you can see, President Kagame leading that. And they've embarked together with the Rwandan Development Board, that's their national body that has embarked on a program to effectively grow the ecotourism model, as they see it as one of the most effective economic growth sectors for the country.
Wow, great. Have other countries come to view Rwanda's model to see what you guys are doing?
Absolutely. I think potentially sometimes with some jealousy in it. President Kagame, I was guiding a group a few years back and was lucky enough to be in the group who had an audience with him. And he described his model as the Singapore of Africa, which is an interesting analogy or interesting comparison to make. I do think that a lot of countries are looking towards Rwanda as a leader on the continent. A number of universities, the university that I'm connected to here in South Africa, is using Rwanda as one of their main models in all of their economic programs. So there's definitely an attentional focus on how Rwanda is successfully growing this ecotourism model, and particularly because they're managing to do it in what is one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. That is what is of particular interest for a lot of African countries, because we all know that Africa is set to show some of the greatest population growth over the next 20 years on Earth. And so the population growth and how we're going to manage these ecotourism models to coexist between wild places and humans is a really acute question at the moment.
Well, unfortunately, that's the last question we have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you, Craig, to see if you have any closing comments.
Thank you so much, Rob. First of all, thank you everybody for your time. And most importantly, thank you for your interest, and thank you for the efforts and the contributions you make when traveling to these beautiful places and protecting them. The ecotourism model would fail without all of you. So thank you from us.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd like to also thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everyone.